Hi, my name is Linnea Hernandez. I just wanted to show you my exhibition for this final project. Basically, the goal of this exhibition is to examine the elements of Jane and Rochester's relationship. And by that, I mean what literary, cultural, and historical elements came together to make this romance possible. Why is this romance unique? Why was it groundbreaking at the time? And what parallels do we see in modern popular culture and literature? So, basically, an overview of this is we're talking about Jane Eyre and why it's unique in terms of what literary movements it falls under and how it has elements of several different movements and why that creates something so unique. So we have the feminist elements of Jane's character and of the novel itself, and then we have from the Romantic era Rochester's like quintessential Byronic hero. Then we have the Gothic elements that kind of work together in a strange way, maybe a supernatural way, to bring Jane and Rochester together and how unique that is in a romantic novel. That's why it's kind of difficult to classify Jane Eyre. Do we classify it by the time in which it was published or the elements behind it? So then we have looking at how Jane Eyre inspired other popular culture and the connections that we can make there. So we have here first studying Jane Eyre in terms of it kind of coming out on the cusp of Romantic literature and Victorian Gothic literature. And it shows strong elements of both and why that's so unique. So, first, we'll discuss. I have a video here that is kind of funny in a way, but it really applies modern sensibilities to the think tank that was the Bronte's household and the Bronte sisters and the way they created seminal literary works. So this video, we won't go into it now, but it basically depicts them as action heroes with action figures that combine together to make a Brontosaurus of literature. And it's just an interesting look into why the Brontes were so unique. And it's important for students to understand the context in which Jane Eyre was written and why it matters in terms of evolution of these ideas over time and into modern times. Next, the video here we don't need to play that here, but we also have a movie that came out within the last couple of years by the BBC. It's called To Walk Invisible, and it's about the life and times of the Bronte sisters. And it's really important that the students understand Bronte's identity and how that translated into her literary works. Uh, so there's the video, there's just the trailer of the film there. So first we'll move to Jane and exploring the feminist elements of Jane and the novel itself, and also connecting to a previous area of study where I made my recent exhibition on Othello and comparing Othello's feminist literary theory elements to Jane Eyre's feminist literary elements using the Bechdel test. And Alison Bechdel is on the IB prescribed reading list. Her ideas are revolutionary in terms of female representation and feminism in literature and film. So we'll take that lens and compare Jane Eyre to previously studied Othello through the lens of Alison Bechdel's work. Then there's a video lecture via YouTube about feminism in Jane Eyre, done by John Bowden, who's a British academic. He does a really great job of explaining why Jane Eyre is so revolutionary. But I also want students to understand that while Jane Eyre is touted as a feminist text, there are things about it that are very anti-feminist, like the treatment of Bertha. So I would love for students to discuss that through a feminist literary theory lens. And then we'll move on to, now that we've discussed Jane, it's really important to understand the romantic elements of Rochester's character and how he is the quintessential Byronic hero. And in order for students to understand how important Byronic heroes are to just literature in general, but also American culture, first we'll study like the the original Byronic Hero, written by Lord Byron in his work, The Corsair. Just identifying elements of the Byronic hero, kind of getting a list of those elements, and then applying it to a famous American Byronic hero, Edgar Allan Poe. He was personally a Byronic hero as himself, and then he kind of translated it almost autobiographically into his works. Byronic heroes as his characters in his works. So we'll read through Annabel Lee and the Raven, kind of comparing that to the Corsair, comparing that to Rochester, and talking about Byronic heroes, kind of strengths and weaknesses. And then finally, kind of bringing the idea of a Byronic hero to home for students, building context, building modern context, and maybe something that's of deeper pop culture relevance to students, identifying Byronic heroes in pop culture: Batman, Han Solo, Kylo Ren, Edward Cullen, Wolverine, Severus Snape, Angel from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Just there's so many heroes today that are beloved by students that, you know, take a page from the playbook of Rochester and the Byronic heroes of old. So connecting that over time and understanding the prevalence of these archetypes really is important for students to be able to pick those characters out and their necessity throughout literature, throughout film, throughout pop culture. So once we've discussed these two characters in the romance, Jane and Rochester, the idea that the feminist Jane and the Byronic Rochester, they wouldn't be able to have come together without the feminist and Byronic elements of their characters. And that's why it's such a unique thing. But another really important factor in their relationship, just as if you were to set a story in New York City would be a character. It's such a intense setting that it becomes a character in any relationship. The same way that Gothic elements in Gothic Victorian literature become a character in any relationship, and especially the supernatural and spiritualist elements, Gothic elements of Jane Eyre, they almost come together to bring Jane and Rochester together. So you have to kind of consider these Gothic elements as main components of their romance. To the climactic moment where they kind of hear each other across the moors through time and space, and to the other elements within the beginning of the novel when Jane hears somebody in the hallway, the fire, the assumption that there's a ghost or some sort of demon, Rochester calling Jane a witch, and so many more supernatural elements. So first, we'll help students understand what supernatural elements are, what the Gothic elements are in fiction, and there's a great discussion by the same company that did the discussion of feminism in Jane Eyre. So the video is listed here if you're interested. And then my body of work that I'd really like to introduce here, that was my favorite podcast for years, is a podcast called Lore. And it's one, it's basically an essayist. His name is Aaron Mahnke. And he takes his essays and puts them in podcast form with this incredibly, specifically composed background music. And he explores the psychological, cultural, and historical components that came together to create folklore. And a lot of his episodes are centered around Victorian England folklore. Everything from the castles and the settings, the moors, everything that comes into play in Jane Eyre, from seances and spiritualism, as you know that there's a spiritualist scene in Jane Eyre, and how it becomes a hoax, and just the discussion of spiritualism and the hoax of spiritualism in several episodes of this podcast. Ghosts and apparitions and hauntings. There's several episodes on that. Demons, witches, and witch hunts. The treatment of the mentally ill is something I'd really love to focus on, and the idea that Bertha's mental illness, even though it seemed crazy to have her up in that attic, Rochester was attempting to save her from the Victorian asylums of that time. And these several episodes here really go into depth about what asylums were like in the Victorian era, and the treatment and the perception of mentally ill people in that time period is essential to understanding Jane Eyre, and understanding how ideas about mental illness have evolved over time. Thank goodness. Um, there's a scene in Jane Eyre about them mistrusting the help, mistrusting governesses altogether. And there's a wonderful episode of this podcast that kind of talks about where that thinking came from in terms of distrusting the help. And then just general Victorian England folklore and the types of myths and legends and uh, popular culture that kind of came together to create the setting of Jane Eyre and how important that setting is to the narrative. So I'll ask students to kind of select a few veins that they'd like to tap, so to speak, for this podcast, and then make connections from the podcast and the psychology of it all to Jane Eyre itself. Then, really, I want students to understand how this Gothic literature element of Jane Eyre was a character in the romance. And it's not just a romantic story, it's a romantic story that could not have taken place without the combined elements of Gothic fiction, romantic fiction, feminism, Byronic heroes. Um, all of those things had to come together to create this unique story. And now that we've identified these elements and how they work together, I thought it would be fun and maybe a little less intense for students to explore. Yes, they need to understand what pastiche, parody, homage, adaptation is, even fan fiction and different types of adaptations of works, and how their place in literary society, I guess. But Jane Eyre is one of those works that just has an incredible amount of works that are inspired by Jane Eyre. And so what I wanted to do is have students select a work, study it, and analyze how that work represents the original elements of Jane Eyre, the supernatural elements, the spiritualism, the feminism, Byronic hero, all that fun stuff, and how the pastiche works kind of treat those elements, and they'll present their findings. But there's a musical and opera. The musical, I love it, has incredible connection to symbolism in Jane Eyre. Opera and ballet. There's a novel that reimagines Jane Eyre as a serial killer. White Sargasso Sea, we know, is a prequel to Jane Eyre, the story of Bertha and Rochester. The Mad Woman Upstairs is a modern novel. uh, Breath of Air is a YA novel where a girl kind of steps into Jane Eyre's world and lives through Jane Eyre's eyes. Sagoff's Jane Eyre is a parody poem of Jane Eyre. There is a wonderful Jane Eyre manga classic that's beautifully, beautifully drawn. The artwork is incredible, but I love how it kind of envelops the setting of Jane Eyre. Uh, the Jane Eyre Facebook edition is a fan fiction work that kind of reimagines a world where the characters of Jane Eyre, if they had Facebook, what their Facebook posts would be like, and the kind of the narrative through their Facebook posts. And any major film adaptation of Jane Eyre, I just like students to make connections between those adaptations in the original work, and Jane Eyre itself through the lens of the other works that we're studying in the year. So that is my exhibition. Hopefully it's what you're looking for. It's been wonderful working with you all. I've enjoyed this training and I'm so excited to, even though it's the COVID craziness, work through these wonderful ideas and underpinnings with my students.